All right, I got my space hat on for key concept 6.1, science and technology in the 20th century. So, we made it to space, we got to the moon for one, but there's a lot of things that changed. We got better communications, better transportation, more violent military technology, better medicine. I could list these forever, but we're going to really focus in on the science and technology that you need to know from the 20th century to do well in your AP World exam. Let's do this. All right, you made it to period 6. This is super exciting. You've been through 10,000 years of human history, and we're finally at the most recent, modern history. It's important to know that this time period is, really focused on the 20th century. Obviously, there's 18 years included of the 21st century, but you're really only going to see questions on the AP World exam that come up to, maybe the 90s. It might extend to 9/11, but it's really not going to extend too much beyond that. We don't have a good sense of how these different events in our most recent history have affected us yet, so we can't really ask you to analyze that quite yet. So there's three key concepts. It's important to know that this time period is not just the world wars. Obviously, those are big factors in the 20th century, but that's not everything. The first key concept is science and technology. Key concept number 2 is global conflicts. That's where you're going to see the world wars. And then 6.3 is globalization and economics. So in this video, I'm just going to take you through 6.1 and really focus on the things that are most important. So let's really pull out exactly what you need to know to be successful in this key concept. So the 20th century, we see a lot of new transportation, and that's, these are really going to change the way that we move around. So, cars, airplanes, space exploration. You've got Henry Ford and the Model T. The car itself was super important. It was actually really affordable, and it allowed people to own a car for the first time. This wasn't something, it was a luxury for a long time, and this became something that, regular working people could actually afford. And it also was, important because they would actually pay people $5 a day in the factory, and they would use the assembly line to make these. And $5 a day seems not so much money now, but then was a lot of money. And I'm not going to just mention Henry Ford without also making sure that you know that Henry Ford was actually a raging anti-Semite and collaborated in many ways with the Nazis. So there's that. There's also the space race that is important as new transportation. We go from beginning of the century not having cars everywhere to the middle of the century literally being on the moon. So that's an important piece of information to remember. So beyond new transportation, we've got new communications. Obviously now our world is so connected because of communication, and if you go back 100 years, it's going to look a lot different. So something like television to really bring people together, families, to spread messages much faster, and it's going to also just increase global popular culture, right? We can all watch the same things now and enjoy them together. New scientific theories are going to really, change how we understand our world, our natural world, and ourselves, our society. You've got scientists like Sigmund Freud, who is, a major thinker in psychology, and will really change the way we understand, human thought, human psyche, right? Like why do we make decisions that we make? And then, of course, Albert Einstein, who is maybe one of the most famous scientists, definitely the most recognizable name. His theory of relativity, I couldn't really explain it to you. I'm too history focused and not science, but it's super important into understanding science and then to creating all kinds of things. So maybe if you know something about that theory, you can comment it below. We've got new environmental issues. So because of all these things, our environment's going to change a lot in the 20th century. This is a big way that humans are impacting the environment. Things like the greenhouse effect, deforestation, erosion, climate change, extinctions. There's lots of different ways that the earth itself is going to change in the 20th century because of human interaction with it. You've got animals that have gone extinct, like the quagga on the left here and the Tasmanian tiger. These are just two examples of many animals that didn't make it to the end of the 20th century, which is, really sad. New diseases are spreading, or maybe they're not new, but we've got different instances of them, really being a problem. And in some cases, we're actually like finding ways to solve them. That we're eradicating them. So, for example, you've got the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic, which after World War One, a lot of the reason why this spreads is because you have all of the they have the military coming back home from Europe, and they're bringing the diseases with them. And so more people are actually going to die from this flu, from this epidemic, than during actual World War One. It's a huge, huge, huge loss of life around the world, and it's really you can kind of trace how it spreads, from people who are involved in the war out back to when they go home after the war. Medical innovations are going to really eradicate some of the diseases that were such a big part of history before the 20th century, that killed so many people or really affected the lives of so many people. And then another thing, like something like birth control, is going to completely change, life for women, and allow for more opportunities for women, in workforce and whatnot. So something like polio, this is cut off a little bit. Something like polio, we've really eradicated most of it. There aren't too many cases anymore. It used to be a completely debilitating disease that was pretty widespread, and would cost a lot of lives, or at least like these children would really affect them for their whole life. And now almost nobody gets polio anymore. That's a huge change. We do see it a little bit still in some of these like poor developing countries, but for the most part it's mostly gone. Energy innovations, where we're really changing the way that we use energy, where we get it from. You got things like nuclear power plants and petroleum that are really changing the way that we are, getting energy. And even now, we're even pushing more towards renewable energy sources and ways that we can, not affect the environment so much like we had before, right? We're trying not to use things like fossil fuels, and instead use, water or solar power. The military technology that changes in this time period is massive. And this is part of the reason why the global conflicts are so intense, right? We have new technology like tanks and planes, and of course the atomic bomb. These didn't exist before. War didn't affect civilian life before the 20th century like it is in the 20th century. You've got tanks. Like, this is a tank in World War One. I mean, think about it. Think about being able to actually like roam through a battlefield with that. You're going to be able to cause a lot more damage and protect yourself a lot better than if you're just kind of walking through, right? And so like that's huge. And this, the tank itself is going to improve massively. Our tanks now are going to look a lot different. Or for example, the machine gun. This is a popular image that you might see with World War One, for two reasons actually. But the machine gun itself, it used to be you can just, your gun is not going to shoot that many bullets at once, and then to be able to, in a battle, just really mow down the enemy is it's absolutely insane. And the World War One in and of itself is such a example of how we have to like change our military tactics because of that. You can't just like charge at each other anymore. If you do that, you're gonna definitely be hit by a military weapon like the machine gun. And also these soldiers have masks on to protect themselves from chemical warfare, which had never been used before. But things like mustard gas are going to be used in World War One. That's pretty devastating to anyone that is affected by that. And then, of course, the atomic bomb. I mean, we don't have the atomic bomb before the 20th century. This is completely going to change everything. Like, we don't, since then we haven't had a massive global conflict because we can't, right? Like, if someone drops one of those, then someone else is going to drop one, and we have this like mutually assured destruction. So it's really changed how we fight, right? How we fight with each other and what the consequences are for that, because that's in our future if we continue to fight with each other. We have, new military tactics, like I had mentioned. So because of the new technology, the military is the way that you have to fight is going to change, and more civilians are going to die as a result of that. So, like trench warfare. If you've got a machine gun coming up at you, you can't just run at your enemy anymore. Instead, you got to dig in and hope that you can hold your line until, you're able to kind of cross through that. So the way that we fight has to have changed. And then, more and more civilians were brought into conflicts because of these things. So, like in World War II, the Germans, the Americans, the British, everybody used things like firebombing on all kinds of cities. So, like, this is an example of Tokyo, which was completely just, they were dropping all kinds of weapons on Tokyo, and a lot of people died. A lot of civilians that weren't enlisted, they weren't fighting, they just were trying to live their lives, and now they're really brought into the conflict. Same thing happens in cities across Germany, in Dresden and Berlin, and then like in London, there's a lot of cities that are really affected by firebombing. And then finally, the Green Revolution, new ways to produce food. So, for example, like GMOs. We've got the Green Revolution in India. This comes as a result of the famine that had existed in India in the 50s. And so they really have to figure out, how do we produce more food? How can we be more sustainable with the food that we produce so that it's not as affected by drought? How can we use better chemicals on the food so that we can, really eliminate, like, use like pesticides, for example. So this is your key concept 6.1. I would encourage you to pause on this slide because everything is up, and take some notes on it. I've kind of made in bold the things that you need to remember that have changed. This key concept really is a lot of changes, right? A lot of ways that you can trace change across this time period, and specifically looking at science and technology. So stay tuned for period 6, key concept 6.2. Hey, this is High Level History, and I'm Amanda Doemerall. If you're an AP World student, tell me how it's going in the comments below. And for more AP World content and review, be sure to subscribe to my channel and follow me on Twitter and Instagram at High Level History.